I always thought I had seen it all. But that day, even I couldn't believe my eyes. The forest smelled of damp earth and young grass. Birds chirped like they had never seen winter, and the wind carried the scent of fresh blossoms. Spring had arrived in full force. But life here wasn't just about beauty, it was about survival. And some didn't survive. I was patrolling the outskirts of the reserve, rifle slung over my shoulder, scanning the tree line for signs of movement. Then I heard it. A faint, trembling whimper. Not a bird, not the wind. Something alive. Something in trouble. I stepped carefully through the undergrowth, boots sinking slightly into the soft soil. And then, in a small clearing, I saw them. 2 grizzly cubs, barely old enough to be on their own, huddled together near a fallen log. Their fur was thick and golden brown, but matted with dirt. They looked exhausted, scared, alone. My gut twisted. This wasn't right. Cubs this young didn't stray far from their mother. And if she was gone, that meant only one thing. Something had happened to her. I scanned the clearing, hoping, praying that she was just out of sight. Nothing. The cubs stared at me, eyes wide with exhaustion and fear, their tiny bodies trembling. My first instinct was to help, to move closer. But then my instinct screamed something else, danger. A low rustle in the distance. Barely audible, but I heard it. A shift in the air. The forest, once filled with birdsong, had gone silent. Predators were near. I turned slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. That's when I saw them. Just beyond the trees, barely visible against the thick underbrush. Eyes, watching, stalking. Wolves. Not just 1 or 2. Pack. At least 6. Maybe more. My pulse pounded in my ears. They weren't attacking yet, but they were waiting, reading the situation. Wolves were patient hunters. They knew the cubs were weak, easy prey, and now I was standing between them and their next meal. For a moment, nobody moved. The cubs huddled closer to the log, their small bodies shaking. The wolves stood still, their yellow eyes locked on their target. The air felt thick, heavy, like a storm was about to break. I gripped my rifle, not raising it yet. A single shot might scare them off, or it might trigger the attack. I wasn't sure, and if they charged, the lead wolf, a massive black-coated alpha, took a step forward. Just one step, testing, calculating. The cubs whimpered again, their tiny voices barely above a whisper. I had seconds to decide, and no good options. The wolves inched closer, their bodies low to the ground, muscles tense, eyes locked on the cubs. Their patience was unnerving. They weren't in a hurry. They knew the cubs had nowhere to run. I had one shot, literally and figuratively. If I fired into the air, maybe they'd scatter. But wolves weren't stupid. They'd be back the second I turned my back. And if I aimed to kill, well, that would be a declaration of war. A dead pack member could make them more aggressive. The lead wolf took another step forward. The cubs shrank back against the fallen log, their tiny claws scraping at the bark, desperate for a way out. But there was no way out. I gritted my teeth. I didn't want to intervene. Nature had its own laws, its own balance. This was how it worked. The weak died, the strong survived. And yet, as I stood there, staring into the desperate eyes of those cubs, something inside me refused to accept it. Then I saw it, something that changed everything. A second set of eyes. No, more than that. Behind the pack, deeper in the trees, a shadow moved. Silent, watching. A bear. Not just any bear. The mother. I barely breathed. She was still alive, but she wasn't rushing in. She wasn't roaring or charging. She was waiting, observing, calculating. I wasn't sure if she had seen me yet, but she had definitely seen the wolves. And yet, she did nothing. Why? The lead wolf growled, low and deep. The rest of the pack followed, inching forward, their intent clear. They were about to attack. And still, the mother bear didn't move. Was she injured? Weak? Or was this something else? A test. My grip tightened around the rifle. I had a split-second decision to make. Fire the shot and risk spooking the mother as well as the wolves? Wait and see what she would do? Or step back and let nature take its course? The alpha wolf lunged forward. The cubs let out a sharp, panicked cry. And in that instant, I made my choice. A week had passed since that moment in the clearing. Since the gunshot echoed through the trees, since the wolves scattered, and since the mother bear finally revealed herself, only to turn and disappear into the forest, leaving her cubs behind. I still didn't understand it. Why had she abandoned them? Was she too weak to fight? Was there something else I didn't see? Questions circled in my head, but I had no answers. All I knew was that the cubs were still alive, and that was enough for now. I kept my distance, tracking them from the shadows, making sure they didn't wander too far from the den I had found for them. They were clumsy, struggling to find food, but they were learning. They had no choice. The forest was alive with danger. Every night, the air was filled with distant howls. The wolves hadn't gone far. They were watching, waiting. Their patience was endless. And the cubs, they were still weak, still vulnerable. One night, I watched as they tried to climb a tree, seeking safety from an unseen threat. They scrambled up the bark, their small claws barely finding purchase. It was instinct, but it wasn't enough. If the wolves came, that tree wouldn't save them. I had to remind myself that I couldn't interfere. Not yet. If they didn't learn how to survive on their own, they wouldn't last. But then something strange happened. The wolves got closer. Not attacking, not chasing, just watching, studying. It wasn't normal. Predators didn't hesitate like this. And yet, every time the cubs ventured into a clearing, every time they found food or water, the wolves were there, observing. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I spotted the alpha wolf standing at the edge of the tree line. He wasn't hunting. He wasn't stalking. He was just there, waiting for something. The cubs saw him too. They froze, their bodies tense, ready to flee. But he didn't move, didn't growl, didn't lunge. And for the first time I saw it, the hesitation in his eyes. This wasn't just about hunger anymore. Something had changed. The attack came just before dawn. The forest was still, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and morning dew. The cubs were curled up beneath a fallen tree, their bodies rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. They had survived another night, but the wolves hadn't left. They had been waiting for this moment. I heard it before I saw it. The crunch of twigs, the low growl that sent ice through my veins. Then the wolves emerged from the shadows, moving in absolute silence. No hesitation, no warning. The cubs woke too late. The alpha lunged first. The cubs scrambled, panicked, their tiny paws slipping on the wet leaves. One managed to tumble behind the log, but the other, he wasn't fast enough. Teeth sank into his hind leg. A sharp yelp echoed through the trees. I raised my rifle, ready to fire, ready to stop this before it was too late. But then something happened, something I didn't expect. The wolf didn't finish the job. He let go. The cub collapsed, panting, his body trembling from shock. The alpha took a step back, watching him. Then he did the last thing I ever expected. He nudged the cub. Not with teeth, not with the force of an attacker. A nudge, careful, almost gentle. I froze, my finger hovering over the trigger. The other wolves didn't move in. They stood back, watching their leader. He circled the wounded cub, sniffing, observing. The cub whimpered but didn't run. He was too weak. The alpha stepped away just slightly, then lay down. Right there, in front of the cub. Not a threat, not a hunter, a test. The cub, injured and shaking, lifted his head. His tiny body tensed. He should have run. He should have hidden. But instead, he crawled forward. The other wolves stayed frozen, silent, waiting. The cub, as if driven by something beyond instinct, inched closer to the alpha. And then, unbelievably, he pressed himself against the wolf's thick fur, desperate for warmth, for safety. And the alpha let him. I exhaled, my grip on the rifle loosening. This wasn't an attack. It was something else entirely. Morning came slowly, the sky shifting from deep black to muted gray. The forest, still drenched in the tension of the night before, felt different, quieter, more uncertain. I barely moved from my position, watching the impossible unfold before me. The injured cub remained pressed against the alpha wolf's side. The rest of the pack had settled nearby, their eyes flicking between their leader and the small, trembling bear. There was no more aggression, no hunger, just something else. Something I didn't yet understand. Nature was cruel. That was a fact. I had seen it countless times before. The weak were picked off, the strong moved on. There was no mercy, no hesitation. And yet, here I was watching a pack of wolves, not just sparing a bear cub, but almost accepting it. The second cub, still keeping its distance, whined softly. He didn't understand either. His brother was alive, but the world had turned upside down. The alpha finally stood, shaking the morning dew from his thick coat. His eyes scanned the tree line, ears flicking at the distant sounds of waking birds. He turned to the cub at his side, nudging him lightly with his nose. A signal. The cub hesitated, his injured leg dragging slightly as he tried to stand. He was weak, but he followed. That was when I realized the truth. This wasn't kindness. It wasn't pity. It was instinct. The wolves hadn't changed. Their rules hadn't changed. The cub had proven something last night. Strength, resilience, whatever it was that made the alpha hesitate instead of kill. And in return, he was being given a chance to survive. But on their terms. And his brother? He had no place here. The second cub took a cautious step forward, letting out another soft whimper. The wolves turned toward him as one. Their eyes sharpened, their bodies tensed. He wasn't part of this. He hadn't passed whatever test the alpha had given. I held my breath. He didn't understand the danger he was in. He only saw his brother, standing among creatures that should have been his enemies. Then, in a blur of motion, the alpha growled. The second cub froze, ears flattened against his head. He had seconds to decide: fight, flee, or stay. I already knew the answer. He turned and ran. I sat in my cabin that evening, staring at the radio in front of me. The message was clear: do not interfere. Park management had caught wind of the situation. Word spread quickly when a lone ranger was tracking 2 orphaned bear cubs in wolf territory. I had been given a direct order: observe, but do not intervene. Nature would take its course as it always had. But what if nature was making a mistake? The second cub was alone now. He had vanished into the trees after the pack rejected him. I had spent the better part of the day searching for any sign of him, but the forest had swallowed him whole. The first cub, the one the wolves had accepted, was still with them. I had watched from a distance as they moved deeper into their territory, the little bear limping after the pack, struggling to keep up. He was weak, but he was learning their ways, learning survival. I should have left it alone. I should have followed my orders. Instead, I grabbed my rifle and stepped outside. The night was thick with fog, wrapping around the trees like a living thing. My boots crunched against damp leaves as I moved through the underbrush, heart pounding with every step. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. The lost cub? The pack? Maybe I just needed to prove something to myself. Then I heard it, a low, pained whimper. I turned sharply, scanning the darkness. It was faint, barely audible over the rustling trees, but I knew that sound. I followed it, moving carefully, my pulse quickening. And then I saw him. The second cub was curled beneath a fallen branch, his fur soaked with mud, his breathing shallow. He had tried to climb, maybe to escape something, but hadn't made it. His body was trembling, his eyes dull with exhaustion. If I left him here, he wouldn't last the night. I crouched beside him, hesitating. This was the moment, the line between man and nature. If I took him, I was breaking the rules. If I left him, I was letting nature decide. A branch snapped behind me. I spun around, rifle raised. Eyes in the darkness. The wolves had followed me. The wolves stood motionless, their eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. I tightened my grip on the rifle, heart hammering in my chest. If they wanted the cub, this was their moment. He was too weak to run, too tired to fight, and I was just one man against an entire pack. But they didn't move. The alpha stepped forward, his breath visible in the cold night air. He didn't growl. He didn't lunge. He simply stared at me, at the cub, at the choice laid before us. I exhaled slowly, lowering my rifle an inch. The second cub whimpered at my feet, trying to lift his head. He was barely holding on. I knew if I took him now, if I carried him back, I could save him. But what would that mean? What was I saving him from? A life in captivity? A fate he wasn't meant for? And then I saw movement behind the alpha. The first cub. He had followed them. He wasn't limping as much now, wasn't struggling to keep up. He was one of them. Not entirely, not yet, but close enough. He had made his choice. Or maybe the wolves had made it for him. The alpha turned his gaze back to me. It was then I realized this wasn't about hunger. This wasn't about a hunt. It was something else entirely. The cub at my feet let out a weak sound, and the first cub took a step forward. Then another. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air between them. Recognizing, remembering, a test. The alpha stepped aside, giving space between them. The second cub hesitated, his small frame shaking from exhaustion. He had seconds to decide, to crawl toward his brother, toward the pack, or stay with me. He took a step, then another. I held my breath as he inched closer, his movements slow but determined. He reached his brother, pressing his head against him. The first cub accepted him without hesitation, nuzzling him in a way that was neither dominant nor submissive. Just familiar, just family. The alpha watched for a moment longer, then turned, walking back into the forest. The others followed, and the cubs followed them. I stood there, rifle at my side, watching as the last traces of them disappeared into the night. Gone. They weren't bears anymore. They were something else. Dawn broke over the treetops, painting the sky in muted shades of orange and pink. The fog that had clung to the forest floor all night began to lift, revealing the quiet aftermath of what had transpired. I stood there for a long time, staring into the trees, but there was nothing left to see. No movement, no sound, just the endless, breathing wilderness. They were gone. I had seen animals do things I never thought possible. I had seen nature's brutality, its cold efficiency. But I had also seen something else, something that didn't fit neatly into the laws of predator and prey. The two cubs had walked away with the wolves. That should have been the end of it. But deep down, I knew their story wasn't over. I spent the next few days in silence, patrolling the edges of the forest, listening, watching. A part of me expected to see them again, to see some sign that they were still out there, surviving. But the forest doesn't work that way. It doesn't leave loose ends for human understanding. Then, one morning, as I made my rounds, I spotted something in the distance. A set of tracks in the soft mud near the river's edge. Not wolf tracks, not bear tracks, but something in between. Two sets of them, side by side, leading into the trees. I followed them for a while, tracing the path they had taken. The prints were deep, strong. They weren't lost. They weren't struggling. They were moving forward together, and that was all I needed to know. I turned back toward the ranger station, the radio on my hip crackling with static. There was nothing more to report, nothing I could explain. Some stories don't have clean endings. Some answers don't come wrapped in logic. I would never know what became of them, whether they survived, whether they thrived, whether the wolves truly accepted them, or if they simply disappeared into the endless cycle of the wild. But maybe that was the point. Not everything is meant to be understood. Some things are meant to be left as they are, wild, untamed, and free. And so I let them go.